Starting a business from scratch is always going to have risks. And for one Australian couple in aviation, it was not only risky but financially challenging. Almost 20 years later, their sheer determination and their love of flying now has them running Australia's only internationally licensed helicopter training facility. They've trained more than 600 military pilots from across Asia and the Middle East, and now have big plans to target China. So how did they do it? Well, I caught up with them on the Sunshine Coast in Australia.
It was challenging because I had a firm belief. I mean, Mike was a good pilot and that he'd worked in a lot of places. He was a good pilot.
After almost 30 years of marriage and nearly 2 decades in business together, Jan and Mike Becker are still good for a laugh. And there's good reason. The company they started with just one helicopter is now the largest internationally recognised training facility of its kind in the Southern Hemisphere.
Still married. Go figure.
Doesn't mean I wouldn't want to kill you sometimes, or you want to kill me sometimes.
Jump in, Scott. Yep. We obviously started out as a normal helicopter flight school, and normal helicopter flight schools are normally run by the owner-operator. They have 1 or 2 helicopters, and they have a small turnover, maybe do 10 or 15 students a year. Now we've got a staff of 70. We operate over 20 helicopters. We're doing over 1,000 hours a month. Approximately 10 to 15,000 training hours a year is what we're doing, and so we've got quite a different model.
And this is their key market, military pilots from abroad.
A RIFTO situation.
This class is a group from the Middle East. But over the last 2 decades, Becker helicopters have trained pilots from across Asia and Europe.
I wanted a contract with Asia because I grew up in Singapore. So the language and the food and the time zone worked. We felt that we couldn't chase down contracts in Europe because the time zones were too difficult. The euro was a big gap. So we sort of targeted Singapore, Malaysia and Hong Kong, and we signed a contract with East Asia Airlines Heli Hong Kong, which is now Heli Express. And that was for 6 students, 2 of which were women. And that really opened the doors to what it was like to train a group of international students.
International students now make up around 95% of the academy. A full international licence takes 180 hours over 10 months and includes skills like night vision goggle training, usually the domain of military aviators.
I know that on the military side since 2008 we've done 225 military aviators, and that excludes all the external training we've done. So that's 225 military pilots that we've put through in a full program.
But probably in 20 years, I'd reckon close to 600 or 800.
Yeah, easy.
And then that's a full pilot's licence. We do a lot of, one-off training.
And the international pilots keep coming. With airspace often limited in Asia and Europe, here on the Sunshine Coast, there's a large area to train. And governments are signing multi-million-dollar contracts to have their pilots trained and sent home with the right aviation requirements.
Asia is still going to be our biggest market. When you look at the numbers, now here's Australia with 23 million people with about 2,000 or plus helicopters, and you look at, say, China with well over 1 billion people, almost 2 billion people, and they've only got 400 helicopters at the moment. Anyone can see that just looking at the numbers that there's potential for growth there.
But it hasn't always been plain sailing. Getting started as a young couple with no finances meant they had to sell their house and borrow around 150,000 Australian dollars to buy their first helicopter. And the banks weren't familiar with the business of aviation.
Aviation doesn't, or specifically helicopter flying, doesn't fit into a box. Banks don't understand it. It doesn't fit into a financial model. Councils don't understand it.
If somebody was living, breathing and wanted to go for a joy flight, we would take them. And so we did a lot of photography, filming, those sorts of things, work that a lot of other people didn't want. But it was financially very, very, very stressful.
And this was their first office, working out of a tin shed. And when they did finally get going and business revenue was up, then came September 11, the Bali bombings and bird flu.
There was a lot of dark days and there was a lot of sleepless nights, and we've never been dishonest with the bank. If things were going badly, we would tell them long before it was ever a real problem. So we found that tenacity made a difference.
That tenacity has paid off, and the dark days are now behind them. Last year, Becker helicopters turned over 20 million Australian dollars, and their efforts are being recognised with local, state and national awards. But for this couple, they do it for the love of their job. As the first civilian training academy in Australia to offer an international helicopter licence, they're also proud of the global business they've created and their team.
Everywhere we go in the world now, there are so many pilots we trained over the 18 years that they're now the captains and they're the training captains on these big companies, and it's an international feel, and we're really proud of that. Hey?
Absolutely.
And the journey is about taking other people with you. If all you do it for is just the money, or
Well, you have to like what you do.
You have to like what
we
you
get
do.
out of bed each day liking what we do.